Hey folks, Brian Bledsoe here with you once again for your December update, and I don't want to waste any of your time. We're going to dive right into the next 2 weeks and what we can kind of expect going forward with this weather pattern that's been largely stagnant for some of us, at least in the near term, and I don't see that changing a whole lot, at least in the short term. And when you look at the areas that are still struggling with drought, you've obviously got areas up here across the northern plains and the northern Rockies. You've got areas down here over the Southwest, even Southwest Texas, parts of Central and Southeast Texas in there as well, and then the Northeast on up into the Ohio Valley. So there are some areas here that are certainly problematic in terms of dryness and drought, but a few of those areas that are not are right here. Parts of the Four Corners states, Southwest Kansas, Northeast New Mexico, right down here in the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas. And that's really sandwiched between the drought that's going on across Wyoming right now, Northwest Nebraska, and also areas farther to the south. So while some of us have been very lucky in terms of the moisture that we've seen, we could certainly use a lot of help in other parts of the country. Let's see if we're going to get any of that help. This is the precipitation anomaly forecast over the next couple of weeks across the Rockies. A lot of brown on the map right there, and that's indicative of generally drier than average conditions, at least over the next couple of weeks. This takes us through the morning of the 26th, so right after Christmas Day. If we look at other parts of the region, you see some areas down here across southeast Oklahoma and across southeast Texas and close to the Gulf Coast. They're actually going to see some rain in this area. But again, areas farther to the west and southwest, not so much, and even farther east will kind of come out on the short end of the stick there as well. So above average precipitation, very hard to come by, not just across the western part of the country, but also a little bit farther to the south. Temperature wise, these are the temperature anomalies that are being forecast from today, which I'm recording this to you on the 11th of December, all the way through the 18th of December. And you see a lot of orange and red on the map there with above average temperatures for a lot of us, including obviously Montana, Wyoming, and down here across parts of the Panhandle region. As we expand that view a little bit farther to the south and east, you see that that kind of holds true. All of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and much of the region still looking at above average temperatures through the 18th. If we look beyond that time frame, from the 19th through the morning of the 26th, we completely flood the western United States with a lot of mild Pacific air. Look at some of these temperature anomalies that are going on across Montana and Wyoming, on the order of 4 to 15, 17 degrees above average. This takes into account nighttime lows and daytime highs. But the main message here is a lot of mild air flooding the western part of the country, and that spills out too into parts of the western plains and central plains states with some cooler than average temperatures, obviously farther east across the lower Mississippi Valley. So a large part of the United States going to be under the influence of this milder Pacific air. That's for the next 2 weeks. Let's look beyond that and let's take care of La Nina and see what the status of our Madden-Julian oscillation is, or our MJO. I think that's going to be a very important ingredient into this long-range forecast as we go forward. We'll talk about that in just a second. But for right now, we still have weak La Nina conditions going on right here across the equatorial Pacific Ocean. And this La Nina episode has been intensifying as we thought it would over the past couple of weeks or so. In fact, if we track its course here, we go all the way back to the middle of September, and you can see we kind of were down here around -1 through most of October, and then we rebounded right up here to near neutral conditions during the heart of November. But I'll tell you what, since then, you can see what we've done. We have been steadily declining here all the way down to close to -1 on the latest report. So the way this has been shaking out is the La Nina has definitely been on the intensifying side of things. And there's a big reason as to why we've been kind of seeing this recent weather pattern lock itself in, because the atmosphere has been responding to it as well. Remember, it's not just about the sea surface temperatures, it's also about the atmospheric pressure. And this is the 30-day running average of the Southern Oscillation Index. And what you need to know again about this graphic is that the positive numbers reflect La Nina conditions, the negative numbers reflect El Nino. And recently, as I got this big red arrow over here, this particular La Nina has been coupling to the atmosphere, and the atmosphere has been responding to it, especially with this latest push. The main reason why is because we've had some really steady easterly trade winds. That's what all of this green and blue is. And I know this is a complicated graphic. So let's start in the upper left where you see December 11th. That's obviously today as far as the forecast goes, all the way through Christmas Day. And what you're seeing here are these easterly trade winds continuing over the next 2 weeks. That's indicative of seeing the blue and the greens. Okay. The reds and the oranges are westerly wind bursts that are continuing to push the way across the Pacific. So, what I want to draw your attention to is down here on the bottom of the graphic, you have westerlies doing that through those regions, and you have easterlies doing that. So, what you get is the MJO sits in phase 4, 5, and 6 because it can't budge. You've got easterlies butting up against westerlies, westerlies butting up against easterlies, and the MJO, the Madden-Julian oscillation, really isn't budging a whole lot. That's the importance and the significance of this graphic because it really acts to tell the story, not only if this La Nina is going to maintain its strength or even intensify, which I think it will because of those easterly trade winds, but if the MJO is going to budge. And right now, at least for the next couple of weeks, it's pretty stuck given the way the pattern is set up. So let's see what the pattern is supposed to do. And I don't think we're going to spend a whole lot of time in phase 4. Okay. I'm going to back up. Here is phase 4, 5, and 6. There's phase 4 right there. I think phase 4, we're probably not going to spend a whole lot of time in. But if we are in phase 4, you get a ridge of high pressure that sets up out there, a trough that sets up right there. We do not have that going on right now. I'm not saying that we can't maybe see a trough of low pressure kind of sneak underneath that ridge at some point, but we would need to be firmly in phase 4 for that to happen. What we are seeing right now is a lot of this. This is phase 5, and we have a ridge of high pressure that's out here. Okay. The trough is up here into Canada. We've got another ridge of high pressure that's off the northeast coast. So there's not a whole lot sweeping in from the Pacific at this time in phase 5. Phase 6 is the same story. Big ridge right there, okay, that blocks things up. And what you get is the jet stream doing something like this with your trough across the eastern part of the country, where the colder and stormier air or weather is actually favoring itself. So, right now, a lot of 4, 5, and 6, especially 5 and 6, does not favor a whole lot of moisture in places like Montana, Wyoming, Kansas, eastern Colorado, down through New Mexico, and the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas. All right. Most of the active weather is situated in other parts of the country as long as we stay here. So, right now, at least for the next couple of weeks, it's really a what you see is what you get type of a thing. And I'm going to continue to track that MJO for you and let you know if there's any movement in that in the coming days once we get beyond Christmas. But the La Nina forecast is still very much the same. For January here, NOAA's model is still the strongest. The BOM and the European obviously are weaker, but still are reflective of weak La Nina conditions right now, which I think is obviously true. If we look at February, you see NOAA's model backs off quite a bit. The European model is still there. The BOM out of Australia is basically a neutral for the month of February, but largely the mean, which is right here, you can see is hovering around negative 0.5, which again is still weak La Nina conditions. March, we see that back off even more. The BOM actually takes us toward positive territory, as does the Meteo model in terms of what the ENSO region is going to be. And by positive, I mean those ocean temperatures will be warming out there for March, and that continues even into April. And it's certainly not going to be full-blown El Nino type criteria. And I still have some skepticism on if this is really going to materialize the way these models suggest. But the main message here is that the Pacific Ocean is going to be transient, meaning it's going from a weak La Nina, and if nothing else, at the very least, it's going to go to neutral territory as we wrap up winter and head into spring. So the Pacific is not going to stay status quo. We are going to see some changes, and those changes are going to be very important in how we track them. So let's look at the near term, looking at history. Okay, this is the overall prevailing weather pattern that we get. We usually have a large blocking area of high pressure that sets up right out here with a La Nina. The storm track goes up, drops down, and anything that is in this sector right here, you get colder and wetter than average conditions. Down here to the south, it's obviously warmer and drier. Okay. With this particular setup, that's traditionally what you get. So with a weak La Nina, let's see what the years of the past. Those are all years where we saw weak La Nina, and we're looking at precipitation anomalies that were averaged out from December through March. All right. So basically the winter months. You're getting wetter than average to wetter than average conditions going on up here across the northern Rockies and the Pacific parts of the Pacific Northwest. Farther to the south, you're getting drier across California and Arizona. Generally, average precipitation here across most of southwest Kansas and the panhandles, really most of Kansas, I would say, be average, even a little bit drier than average. But I keep this in mind, okay? This is all the way back to around 1950. Some of these years behaved a little bit differently than others in terms of precipitation, but those are those years averaged out. Temperature wise, it really favored colder than average conditions up here across most of the northern Rockies and northern plains. Farther south, you could see we were generally warmer than average across the southern tier with those years all the way back to 1950. What if we look at just the past 5 weak La Nina events in the past 25 years? What do we get with that? These are the precipitation anomalies that you get, which I personally think are much more indicative of what we have a shot to see December through March. So you get largely drier than average in Arizona, New Mexico, large part of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, and then certainly here across the southeastern portion of the United States. Okay. You get wetter than average for parts of California, Nevada, Utah, the northern Rockies, and northern plains. It's similar to what I showed you, but the dry anomalies really start to show up much more in the past 25 years with the way the Pacific Ocean has been stacked versus what we saw before. And if we look at temperature trends, it's largely the same. Colder than average in the Pacific Northwest, Northern Rockies, Northern Plains, even in the Midwest and Western Corn Belt. And then you have warmer than average conditions here across Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, all of Texas for the most part, and down along the Gulf Coast. That's what history says should prevail. All right. So if we know what history says is supposed to happen, and we know this weak La Nina is going to prevail through the heart of this winter, let's see what the seasonal model forecast looks like. This first image is really important that I'm going to show you. It is the upper level weather pattern for December, January, February, and March, the way the European seasonal model sees it. We start out in December, and you see we change quite a bit. I'm going to let this go a couple of times. Here's where we are now. Big ridge over the west, okay, flooding the country with Pacific air. And then look what happens after we get past December. Big trough right through here. All right. And that is the prevailing weather pattern there for really January, February, and March. The ridge backs up from the west coast of North America back into the Aleutians and the Bering Sea. And that has a huge impact on the United States, because what that does is it kind of opens up the window of opportunity for storminess and cold air to drop down in this sector, essentially the northern half of the country. Even the southern tier of the United States could see some cold plunges that make their way all the way down across Texas, Oklahoma, and even to the Gulf Coast. Canada is cold. Canada is going to remain very cold. There's a lot of snowpack up there right now, and we are entering the shortest days and the longest nights of the year. So that cold air is just going to do nothing but refrigerate up there. And when this pattern changes, it's going to allow cold air to come into the country. I think that pattern takes place in January and largely continues into February and March. I've not only seen this trend on the European model, but also other computer models. But the European model I favor the most because it's been doing the best job with the overall pattern. In fact, I can show you based on its December forecast. This is its precipitation anomaly forecast for December. And you can see all the dry anomalies. Look at all the brown across the country, and look up here in the Pacific Northwest and California, much drier than average because of that ridge that's out there. So when we remove the ridge, this is what the European model says for January. We've got wetter than average anywhere you see in green. Okay, even as far south as, say, southeast Colorado, parts of Kansas, getting in the act too. If you have interest in this quadrant, This is the area of concern. Southern California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, especially the western parts of those states, largely drier than average. All right. You're going to continue to see this pattern perpetuate in February, right there. We're still wetter than average Northwest and in the Mississippi and Ohio valleys, Great Lakes, dry West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California. There you are for March. Very much the same story, a little bit drier than average here, extending northeastward into southeast Nebraska and parts of Kansas. But really, the farther north you go, the better off you're going to be in terms of moisture. Then, if we go into April, you see the dryness starting to expand northward. Okay. It's doing something like this. And that little bit of dryness that starts to show up in April continues for that same area largely in May. Wyoming, parts of South Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, even still down here in the parts of the Southwest, we're seeing that. Southern Montana in the Act 2. If we look at June, it's kind of a mixed bag. There's pockets of wet, pockets of dry. Let's put June on the shelf for right now. It's a long ways out there, and there'll be some things change between now and then where we can kind of dial in that forecast a little bit more. But the NMME model showing the same thing. This is its precipitation anomaly forecast for January. Notice all the wetter than average conditions here. That's going to do nothing but continue to build that snowpack and that cold air source across Canada. February, very much the same story. You are drier than average in this quadrant, all the way down into Mexico. In fact, some of those real nasty anomalies down into Mexico are creeping into southwest Texas and southern New Mexico during that time. Wetter than average Wyoming and points north. March, very similar. Drier south, wetter north. April, that dryness starts to expand northward, pushing into southern Wyoming. Still doing so in May, even coming into the Pacific Northwest, but you can see where that dry quadrant is located, okay? June, the dryness relaxes a little bit down here in the southern plains, but it kind of flexes here across Wyoming and the Pacific Northwest. And July, we still see some of that going on. The interesting thing about July is it starts to show up dry here in the Corn Belt, especially the Western Corn Belt in the midsection of the country, including Kansas. So we've got some work to do with that forecast to see just how valid this is going to be as we head towards summer. We have a lot of work to do on this. So I don't want you to just say this is doom and gloom out there for the summer, but there are some things that I am concerned about for this summer, as I have talked about in the past. The Climate Prediction Center's forecast for January, February, March, again, drier south, wetter farther north. If you go March, April, May, that dry artifact is still over the southwest. And what that's going to do is well, my illustration's getting a little bit off here, but that dryness is going to start to do that. In fact, it starts to anchor itself up here in the northern Rockies for May, June, July. I still think we could be dry down here in the panhandles and across southwest Kansas, New Mexico, these areas too. So I think this dryness could even be expanded a little farther south. If we go to July, August, September, that dryness also starts to do that. All right. It expands its way out of the northern Rockies and southeastward into the Western Corn Belt. I know that's a long ways out there, folks. So that's something that we're just going to have to continue to monitor, at least in the near term. Okay. So, with that in mind, I know December has been fairly kind to us in terms of how winter has been so far. But my main message for January, February, March, buckle up for some winter, especially in the northern Rockies and northern plains. The farther south you go, I think we're going to start to see the wind kick up more. I think we're going to see some frequent cold fronts come through. So, we will probably see some wild temperature swings. And much like what I've said now for months, a highly variable weather pattern, especially as we push into January, February, and March. So if you have livestock interest, if you start calving in January, if you start calving in March, these are some things you need to be thinking about going forward because I think the lion's share of whatever we see for this winter in terms of winter weather is definitely going to show up for those 3 months. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to reach out to me via my phone or email right there. I don't want you sitting on those questions. If you got them, let's address them and get some answers for you. If I don't hear from you again through the month of December, I hope you, your family, have a very Merry Christmas, and we'll be chatting with you again soon in January. You folks be well.